welcome back to another episode of Wiggy Reviews. Today we are going to continue in Deborah Harkness's All Souls trilogy with her second book, Shadow of Night. Alright, so Shadow of Night is the second book in the All Souls trilogy that continues the story of Diana Bishop and Matthew Clairmont. Diana Bishop is a witch. Matthew Clairmont is a vampire. They are in love, and that is against the rules of the congregation, who are now after them. But that's not the only reason. The main reason they're after them is because Diana happened to have come across a mysterious alchemical book called Ashmole 782, which may or may not hold the answers to the secret of life, the universe, and everything, at least in the sense of the creatures that live in this world, aka... otherwise known as witches, demons, vampires. Diana herself is a witch, part of a very powerful family, the Bishops, and Matthew Clairmont is a vampire, and as we discover, he is part of a very powerful vampire family, one that is well known and feared. So let's just hop right into it. So, in the last book, Matthew and Diana met, they fell in love, they discovered that the group that kind of governs the creatures of the world, the congregation, are now after them because A, they aren't supposed to be together, and B, for the Ashmole 782, the alchemical book. So in order to escape the congregation, especially after the congregation starts to become more violent towards them, Diana is captured and tortured at one point in the first book. Matthew is... kind of attacked. He's attacked by an old lover that one of the congregation vampires introduced him to and told her to go, really to kill Diana, but also to kill Matthew if they couldn't get Diana to come quietly, and da-da-da-da-da. Bottom line is, they now have to run away and escape these people, and Diana still doesn't know magic very well, so she still needs to find witches to teach her, and due to some hints given to them when they go to Diana's home in Madison, in Pennsylvania, they decide that the best thing to do is to disappear into a different time. So the time they chose is 1591 London. And that is all before the start of this book. So let's get right into this book. Matthew and Diana are now in London, 1591. And they are... I can now talk about this since it's not a spoiler, because now that we're in the second book, you should already know this. They have decided that they are in love. They got married. Married to them, they're married. To the rest of the world, not so much, as we find out later in this book. Diana warns her aunts that the congregation knows where they live and that they should go and hide out with Matthew's family in Septours, with Isabeau, where they'll be safe. So they go to Septours in France to stay with Isabeau, Sarah Bishop, Diana's aunt, and her partner Emily Mathers. And so now that since they know that they are now safe, Matthew and Diana start a new life in London, 1591. But there's always a catch, so, time travel, blah, blah, we have to keep the timelines, no, don't cross the streams, all that. Though, since Diana wasn't born yet, she doesn't really cause any problems when she arrives. She just kind of becomes an extra body in the time period. However, since Matthew was alive during that period, they could run into a bit of trouble at the beginning, where his nephew, the son to his other brother, vampire brother, Gallo Glass, finds them and says, "What the hell happened to you? You were walking right next to me, and suddenly you disappeared. What the hell?" And then because of that, he had to tell Matthew's father. So Matthew's father is now like, "I need you to come home because I gotta figure out what the hell you were doing. What are you thinking, oh, you stupid son of mine?" So before they can even begin to try to find witches to help Diana, before they can even try to discover if they can find Ashmole 782, the alchemical book, before it became hidden away from the world, they have to go back to Septours in in the 16th century and confront Matthew's father, who was killed during World War II, and Matthew hasn't seen since then, obviously, because he was dead. So that brings up a whole mess of emotions for Matthew, and he has to pretend that none of that happened. He has to pretend to be him during that time period, and it's all, it's that whole family drama that comes. Luckily for them, Isabeau is not home at the moment, so that is great. So they go to Philippe, Matthew's father, Philippe de Clairmont, and they stay there, and Philippe is angry that his son is cavorting with a witch. What are you doing, son? It's against the congregation, you know this. And so he says, you have to stay here until we can figure out what to do. So they spend some more time at Sept-Tours in the 16th century, and Philippe kind of knows that Matthew is different. He realizes that Matthew is different than the Matthew he's used to, and he kind of works out that they aren't from that time period, especially once he kind of confronts Diana a little more, and they eventually decide that they have to tell him that they are time walkers, that they're from the future, and so there's a whole bunch of that, and luckily, through this, we also discover that they can affect the future, as Philippe leaves a note for Isabeau that she'd never found, but then she starts noticing strange things and searches, and she finds this note explaining that he met Diana and Matthew, and but that's a whole other side thing that so eventually his father officially marries them in his eyes, and he officially declares that Diana is his daughter now, through a ritual that is a vampire ritual thing, without turning her into a vampire. And Diana discovers more secrets about him. She realizes that he has this strange disease called blood rage, which makes him go completely feral, and he's very dangerous. He doesn't know what he's doing. He just becomes basically pure instinct, and all of that. So she learns that about him, and then she accepts him for it. She says, it doesn't matter, I've already agreed to marry you, I love you, we'll find a way to work through this, I trust you, I know you can control it, because you've proven that you can in the past. And eventually, Philippe lets them go back to London, where they are, number one priority is finding witches to teach Diana magic. That's all in the first, of the book. So let's get right into London. So London, Diana discovers that Matthew is part of the School of the Night, which was a rumor through historians. Historians have rumors about it, that included a bunch of historical figures. They have them right here. It is, one of them happens to be Christopher Marlowe, a playwright that was around the same time of Shakespeare, and a lot of people sometimes attribute some of Shakespeare's plays that Marlowe actually wrote them, and then Shakespeare stole them, but there's always talk about that. George Chapman, not Thomas Harriet. So many people, so many names. Sir Walter Raleigh. So there are a lot of historical figures in this book, which was something I was a little nervous of, but I'll get into that later. So she meets the School of Night. She learns that Matthew is kind of important in London, especially through the School of Night, that they're, doing all these secret things, like studying astronomy, trying to prove, scientific and mathematical things, all that stuff. And it falls into the same trap that the first book fell into when you went to Sept-Tours. A lot of the book is them just kind of hanging out, learning about the period, learning how to act, or for Matthew, relearning how to act in that time period, and not much gets done. We don't really find any witches to teach Diana. They try to reach out for some people, but they end up being, spies or people that they can't trust. They send someone to go look for Ashmole 782 in that time period, and occasionally he comes back and says, I still haven't found it, but I've heard rumors, then he disappears again. So I'm going to skip ahead. Fast forward. So Diana meets the queen. She meets other historical figures. There's a point where they go to Prague because they hear that the book is there. But before that, I'm jumping ahead of myself. So they eventually find witches to help Diana and to teach her, and she learns that the reason magic has been so hard for her to control is because she's not like other witches. She can't just read random spells that other witches have written. She is something called a weaver, which means she has to make up her own spells, and that's the best way for her to use magic is just making up her own spells, which is kind of what she was already doing, because she would desire something and it would happen, or she would ask a question and her magic would answer it for her in some way or another. So she luckily finds a coven of witches that has a weaver among them, and they agree to help her, claiming that she is a part of a prophecy. Her and Matthew were meant to be together, and ironically, around this time, they discover that Diana is pregnant. And they're like, this is part of the prophecy, two bloods mixing, giving birth to a child. So Diana starts to learn about her new abilities as a weaver, which I will say I liked the idea of it. I like how Harkness wrote it. It was very intriguing how magic is just kind of these threads that connects everything together, and weavers can take these threads and tie them together to create spells, or tie them together to make things happen, all that kind of stuff. That's very interesting, and I really liked it. I thought it was great. Then there were the more action parts where there was danger that they had to be worried about their secrets. There were parts where people were they were in danger of being outed as a witch and a vampire. There were people wanting to basically burn Diana at the witch if they could prove that she was a witch. Wait, burn Diana at the stake if they proved she was a witch. There we go. So there's that added, because they're back in 1591 with the witch scares going on through London, and people are being burned and killed and tortured, and asked if they're even accused of being a witch, even if they aren't witches. They get a clue as to where Ashmole 782 is, and it ends up being in Prague, so they have to go to Prague to where this crazy ruler, who is a huge womanizer, is trying to woo Diana because he thinks she's the most beautiful creature in the world, and Matthew, being highly territorial and very protective, keeps butting heads with him, and they do eventually see the book. Finally, we see the book, and they immediately discover what is so important about it, and they realize they have to get it. They have to take it. They have to get it away from the guy who has it in Prague, because he's too dangerous to be allowed to have it. They steal the book, but unfortunately pages are torn from it, which is how it is in modern day, and they decide that they can't keep it. They have to return it to the owner, who will eventually give it to Ashmole, who will eventually donate it to a library, who will eventually die, and then the book will be donated to the library where Diana found it in the present. After that, Diana learns a little more about her weaving abilities, and then they realize that they have to leave because they've stayed too long. Really, when you're a time walker, you shouldn't stay longer than a week, maybe 2 weeks at the most, because even the smallest thing you do can drastically affect the future. They realize that and since Matthew is acting weird for the Matthew during that time period, they realize we've already changed too much. We can't stay. We have to go back home. And we now know what is so important about Ashmole 782. Diana knows what her magic is. She understands how it's different. She understands how she can actually learn and build it up and become a better user of it. So they return to present day. That is the basic plot, leaving out a whole other bunch of side stories that went on, but that was the basic flow of it. And I guess I should mention, because I will be also reviewing the third book. I don't know what will be happening in the third book. We'll find out. But I will also mention that when Diana discovered that she was a weaver, she went through a process of discovering her magic, opening her magic, and she did create a familiar, which only weavers can have, a witch familiar, and it happens to be a fire drake, which is a dragon with only 2 legs, so not exactly a dragon, as they keep saying in the book. But she's a fire drake, which means she's a balance of fire and water, and we learned that her father was more of the fire, and her mother was more of the water, and put that together, and you get Diana. So yeah, there's the basic plot, story, and all that. So let's get into the characters, because they are a little different than the first one, obviously, because the first one, Diana, was a stubborn, independent woman who denied her magic heritage, being a witch and all that, and wanted nothing to do with it, and now she is fully embracing it, actively seeking out people to help her learn more about it, and now in 1591, where women are not viewed positively when they are independent, unless they are the queen, obviously, so her character changes a little bit. I feel like she got a little weaker. And it could be just because you could argue that it's because she's discovering her powers and she's becoming the student again, whereas she's a professor in the first book. So now she's going back to being a student, so she's a little more questioning and a little more hesitant in things. But I think that's silly. I mean, when you're an independent, strong woman in the first book, for those reasons, and then in the second book you become a little bleh, just because you have questions. Let me also clarify, she is still strong and independent, but I feel like the author did a lot of research to, make sure everything flowed well in the 1591 story arc, and I feel like she really wanted to show off that she did a lot of research. I mean, I believe she's also has, degrees in this stuff, in that particular history, so I can't really be that picky about it. I mean, she knows her stuff. I didn't question this. What she was telling me, I didn't question the history stuff. I was just like, okay, yeah, that's what happened. Okay. But I feel like it dampened the story a little bit, and it dampened some of the characters. Like I said, Diana became a little more of a weaker character than the first book, which was sad because she was great as a strong, independent woman. And then in this one, she was so much more of, she just kind of became a housefrau, a housewife kind of housefrau, because that's all she could do, because Matthew tells her, you can't just wander around, everyone will know you're a witch, and it's too dangerous for you to wander around as a witch, because people are burning witches alive at the stake everywhere, and there are dangerous creatures in this town that you have to be careful of, because they'll want to try to kill you, or they'll want to try to control you, and all this stuff, and so she became kind of more passive because she had to stay indoors a lot more. She had to have, guards with her everywhere she goes. And then Matthew kind of falls back into how he was during that time period, which I actually really liked. I think that was a good thing for Deborah Harkness to do, was have him go back to how he was in that time period. Even though it wasn't a conscious choice, really, it just kind of naturally happened. He just kind of fell back into it. It was very clean, mix into how he used to be, probably in the 16th century. Gallaglass, the introduced nephew, was a good character. He was in it a lot, but it didn't feel like a lot. He just kind of popped up every now and then. Philippe de Clairmont was brilliant. I'm happy that we did actually get to see him, because in the first book they mentioned him a lot, and they talk about how he was a great, stubborn, angry, scary, wonderful, so many things contradicting. So it was great that we actually got to see him. And he was brilliant, scary, wonderful, horrible, infuriating, stubborn, all of that. But you could see that he deeply cared for his family. He really cared about them, and he was always a step ahead. A very intelligent man as well. The School of the Night was an interesting thing. The only purpose it really served was to show how life was back then. They also served to remind Diana how old Matthew was, that he used to do this every day, talk to them, be with them, have these conversations, and fight for mathematical and scientific breakthroughs and all that stuff. And Christopher Marlowe became kind of a scorned lover, because he loved Matthew, and he ended up being a demon, because I know I didn't mention this in the first review, just because it didn't really, I mean, it has a lot to do with it, but it's an interesting idea that Harkness has suggested in her universe, is that demons aren't like the horned creatures that like tempt man to do sin. Most of them end up being geniuses or artistic, like Mozart and Christopher Marlowe, and like people who are really good with money, like people who are like basically, geniuses, virtuosos. All those tend to be demons because they have such a strange grasp of the world that they can, like, they're very artistic, or they can either be very artistic and very flowy, or they can be very numbers. It's an interesting idea. I did actually like it because it kind of helps. It's interesting because, we always wonder about, like, these virtuosos and these geniuses, like, where do they come from? They just kind of come out of left field. And, like, this is an interesting way of explaining them, I guess. Because demons can come from two humans. They can come from two humans, or they can come from pretty much anywhere. They just kind of appear. So Christopher Marlowe is a demon, and he ends up kind of being butting heads with Diana a lot, so he adds a nice little conflict that kind of goes nowhere, but yet comes back suddenly and very violently. But I won't get into that. And then we get to, I mentioned that there were a few concerns I had. So let's just get right to the concerns. I mentioned in the last video that I was worried that the history would bog down the action of the story, or would bog down the story, and at points it did. Again, she had these moments where it was like they completely forgot what they were there for. Like, they were like, well, we sent someone out to look for the book. We don't have to worry about it anymore. We don't have to talk about it anymore. We'll eventually find witches for you, but right now we need to focus on this political stuff that's going on. We need to focus on you learning how to survive in this time period, blah, 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 blah. And all this took up so much of the book. It took up so much of the book. And not that it wasn't interesting, it was just a lot of wondering, are we going to find out anything about the book? Are we going to find any witches that are going to teach Diana? Are we ever going to do anything? Like, we're just hanging out and talking to the queen occasionally, and then we go to this other lady, this other person who's high in society, and I like her because she studies alchemy, which gives her and Diana a little friendship. And they study this alchemical marriage, and they discover there's a parallel between this alchemical marriage that they're studying, which is between the sun and the moon, and Diana and Matthew, because Matthew is a vampire, Diana's a witch, and they can breed. And it was previously believed that other creatures couldn't breed with other creatures, like vampires, witches, demons, vampires, all the combinations they couldn't breed. So there's this parallel between this alchemical marriage and Diana and Matthew's relationship, so they think that's another reason why the Ashmole is so important, because maybe it'll explain why certain creatures can breed together. When we finally got to the point where Diana had found witches to help her and teach her, and we finally got to the point with the Ashmole 782, the story moved along very well. It was great. So I guess I had the same issues that I had with the first book, where there was this period kind of in the middle where nothing happened, and it was just kind of, things happened just kind of to show off that things were happening. It wasn't so much to progress the story as in just kind of pointing out, like, oh, Diana has a new power, oh, she's seeing things, oh, this person over here is this person in this town wants to put Diana to trial. Oh, but we're going to forget about that after we visit, and Matthew scares us off, whatever, blah, 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 blah. And, like, a lot of things that happened were kind of like, they were interesting, but they weren't really essential to the story, in my opinion. Maybe they were, maybe I missed something, I don't know. So I will say that I felt this book was weaker than the first book. Like, the characters were a little, like, Diana's character kind of weakened, Matthew's character just kind of, went, in a sense, it kind of 360, because he fell back into his old habits of how he used to live, but he'd come back to how he is a modern scientist and all this, and it didn't bother me as much as Diana being a little bit of a weaker and less independent woman. the historical figures that were introduced were interesting. I liked how she wrote them. I just felt like there was a lot, and some of them didn't, like, Raleigh, Sir Walter Raleigh, like, I know he played a part in helping them, but I can't remember what it was. So, I know he helped them, but he was just so briefly in some parts that I don't really remember. Like, I know he was there and they talked a lot, but and the idea of them interfering with the timelines was interesting. Like, they did flash back to the present and show that the things they were doing were changing. Like, Isabeau was paying attention to things being auctioned off, like new items that hadn't been discovered before and being recently discovered, and that she knew Diana and Matthew had something to do with, and purchasing them to keep their secret from the modern congregations. They couldn't figure out where they went, and like, that was interesting because it showed how time kind of will fix things if you don't change something too drastically. Like, it'll find a way to fit things in. Like, it found a way to fit Diana's things that she left back then. Not things she brought from the present back and leaving, but I mean things she purchased, things she had made for her. They found a way to incorporate that. She found a way to make that make sense, and time kind of finds a way to fit it back into time. Time. So that was all interesting. But it still felt like a weaker book than the first one to me, because the first one was exciting. We had this whole, like, her doubting herself and not really wanting to become to follow in her mother and father's footsteps of becoming a witch. And then the second one where it felt weaker to me. Like, it felt like the characters were a little less. What it really felt like was that it could have been a completely different book. That's what it felt like. That's why it's weaker to me. I felt like this could have been a completely different story with different characters, and it would have worked. I felt like maybe this could have. It felt like it was written differently, but not in a good way. Like, you know how sometimes you want to write differently for a different style take or whatever to continue a story, and I know it takes place in the 1591. She had to integrate all of that stuff, like the historical facts, like geography and like the beliefs and all that, religion and all that stuff into there. But I felt like it could have been its own book. Like, I don't know. I don't really understand why they had to go back in time, because they ultimately didn't. They succeeded in her learning her magic, because there aren't any more weavers in the present time, so I understand that. But really, all they really did for the book was they discovered it and they actually got a look at it. Which, I mean, I know that was the problem, that they couldn't get another look at it where it was. Like, she couldn't call the book back for some for a magical reason. The book didn't want to be found again. So I guess that makes sense, but it felt kind of like a stretch. Like, did they really have to go back? I mean, I'm sure they're, like, for that, I mean, because I feel like if they'd just gone back for her to learn how to be a witch from, you know, a period where there were more witches, that would have been enough. Like, I don't think you had to have the extra thing with the book. But, I mean, I don't, you know. It answered questions, I guess, but it just, like I said, it felt like it could have been a completely different story, and it would have worked fine. It was kind of a break in the main storyline for me, and it just kind of had the characters, and they were just kind of in this world. I don't know, maybe it'll all make sense once I read the final book. Maybe it'll all tie things together. Maybe they'll realize things that they did back then affected the present in a certain way that they didn't realize. We'll see. Because I will be reading the third book, and I will be reviewing it as well. So I guess, I know for the first book I gave a 7 out of 10. For this one, since I felt it was weaker, and I enjoyed the very beginning, and I enjoyed let me rephrase. My favorite part of the book was, like, the last third, after she found witches to teach her, and after they did find the book. Like, that was my favorite part of the book. Everything else before that, I was just kind of like, I have to get through this until they actually find stuff and start doing that. So I guess compared to the first book, where I liked the beginning and the end, and the middle kind of dragged for me, this one, the beginning and the middle dragged for me, and the ending was the best. So 7 out of 10 for the first book. I'm going to give this one I'll give it a 6 out of 10. No, I'm going to give it a 5.5 out of 10. That extra half, just because it felt like it could have been a completely different book. So 5.5 out of 10. Not that it was bad, it just dragged for me. It took a long time to get to things. Yeah, so, and I mean, I understand most second books do that. It's a lot of filler, or not filler, but it's a lot of discovery, and it's a lot of learning, and but the stuff that I wanted to see them learning didn't happen until the end of the book, so it was kind of like, the history stuff was interesting, and I did enjoy it, but it just could have been a different book. She could have just written a historical fiction based on those characters, and I would have been just as happy. I don't know. So 5.5 out of 10. So again, I'll be reviewing the third book, which I believe is called The Book of Life, once I finish it. And I will get that review up as soon as I finish it. And I'm hoping that it will be kind of like now a combination of the first and second book, where I like all three parts, beginning, middle, and end. I'm hoping that we break this habit that she has of just having them go to places and just being there and waiting for something to happen. It's like, I don't want to read about characters waiting for things to happen. I want to read about characters doing things. So 5.5 out of 10 for Shadow of Night. And I guess I will see you for Book of Life next time on Wiggy Reviews. Bye!